follow that. It's impossible. Always difficult and embarrassing when people introduce you. Yes, and you can make up your own minds when you see the work. You don't have to believe what I say or other people say. Yes, so the program. Well, first of all, thanks. Thanks to Filmforum and to Mark and to REDCAT for the invitation. Thinking about Trump's wall, I was coming in, all the rude, nasty things I've said about Hollywood. Somebody at the immigration should certainly have stopped me coming in at all. I'm surprised that anyone let me come in here. But anyway, what are we going to look at? You've got most of the things that you want to know about the films in here, films and videos. The one thing, I think that the thing, I wasn't going to introduce anything about the films, but it's probably nearly 40 years since I first came to LA, and it was I was the guest then of Elfriede Fischinger, who was an incredible person. I obviously, like most experimental filmmakers, I have a great regard for Oskar Fischinger, although I'm not really that keen on his work. But I loved Elfriede Fischinger, and she took us around and was an incredible bundle of energy and introduced us to Los Angeles in an extraordinary random kind of way. So that was 70 years ago. With this program, it's this particular evening is very much chosen by Mark. Oh, the reason I bring up Elfriede is that the last piece in the program it's not a homage to Oskar Fischinger so much as an apology to Oskar Fischinger. I thought it'd be quite nice to just say something about that. The rest of the things, it's really, my influences were not really cinema. My main influences were painting and jazz and music. So that's the background. And we did think we might be able to do a performance work, didn't we? But we haven't got that together. So I'm going to do one now. A minimal performance. I didn't know I was going to do this until we. I suppose we could call this minima. There we go. That's it.
Yeah, thank you. So that last piece, I want to do the entire Q&A only on the last piece. What I was thinking about, and some of the humor in that last piece for me, has to do with knowing that in the late 60s, early 70s, you and some other filmmakers in London put a huge amount of effort and labor into making, first of all, accumulating equipment and having essentially a workshop and a lab that artists could use, and just all the time and the testing and this like really manual, physical labor that went into making films like Berlin Horse and Little Dog for Roger and many others in Threshold. But then this piece literally in part came out of using like prefab effects and prefabricated music to some degree, and so the irony there is for me a big source of the humor, and I'm just wondering if you could maybe just speak briefly about this last piece.
You want talk about the last piece?
Yeah, just a little bit.
Oh, but it's a crazy piece, really. It's you're right that it is a sort of apology to someone like Oscar Fischinger, who would spend hours and hours and hours to produce a very small and very tight piece of film. And this is produced almost entirely using absolutely standard bits of effects that you have on a digital editing system. And it was also a kind of punishment to myself, because one of the things that I said when I was working, exploring computer and digital work, it began at a time when there was no off-the-shelf software, absolutely none. The very first piece that we looked at, I produced that. It took me nearly 9 months to produce about 8 seconds of film. The very yes, Your Lips.
Can everybody hear okay, by the way?
Yeah, you can hear. So that took me a long time to do it, and then I worked with the Atari. We haven't seen any of the Atari pieces. I've got them in some of the other shows that we've got. I, again, had to do all the programming myself. And I sort of got to a point where I said, nobody can possibly do anything useful with digital work, or we called it computer work. Then the digital came in later, really, the term. And it's unless they can program, because otherwise what you're doing is you're simply reproducing the creative work that's been done by the technicians who are producing the program. So the program is more dominant than the work. And I got to this point where this is personal a bit, but my daughter also was making video. She came down to visit me one day, and she said, I'd like to edit something, please. She brought all the stuff with me, and I'll do it on your machine. And I was using a very primitive editing system at that time, not very sophisticated. And she started to edit something for herself, and she said, what are all these effects here? I said, oh, I never touch those. I said, I only ever do a dissolve and a cut. They're just really horrible. I could never. So she said, no, you should use them. And I said, no, not a chance. And then when she'd gone home, I looked at them. I thought, I know what I'll do. One morning, I'll take a morning and make a work that is entirely using every single one of these effects. And of course, so I started to do that. And it didn't work like that, because I started to get interested in them. And I started to get interested in the way that you could overlap them and change the speeds and so on. So like 3 weeks later, I've got something that's beginning to look like it's a workable video, and I'm actually quite enjoying. And the color is produced by, I don't know if the early digital video, if you ran it very fast, you got these pixelated little squares of color. So that's the kind of base color of this that is then put in through these stupid effects. And then the next bit was, I didn't have a soundtrack for it. And again, this is personal. Now my grandchildren were coming to visit me. And, you know, at home we'd have muesli and all those kind of healthy things for breakfast and homemade bread and all those things. But when your grandchildren come to visit, you go out and you buy cornflakes and Cocoa Pops and those sorts of things. Well, one of the cornflake packs that I picked up actually had a free CD for authoring music. And so I thought, okay, this is the answer to that. I'll use this piece of, and so I authored a complete piece of music. Now there's another version of this with my soundtrack on. This is a different version. This has got my grandson's soundtrack, which he did specially because he liked the video, and he said, you know, I'd like to make a soundtrack for that. And so I said, fine, you can do a soundtrack. And so some of these things don't happen with any particular logic, and you start out, I started off, I had no idea where I was going. That's why I said jazz is a big influence for me, because I don't think there's any work that I've done where I've really predicted what the end point is. I've kind of gone from step to step and produced it along the way, and I think that's pretty true of all of them. Is that good enough?
Yeah, that's great.
I love that the piece came out of you saying, okay, I hate these things. Why do I hate them? Let me find out.
Yeah.
Like it came from a curiosity to overcome your dislike in a way. This piece came from, in some ways, a curiosity about what was the nature of your dislike.
I think in some ways there's always been, even with After Lumiere, the very first piece, what was going on in London then? We were all talking about structural materialist film, and everything was about film material and structure. The thought that you could do a piece which had sync sound and narrative was also a kind of break. I was breaking something within our own constructed tradition. I never wanted to just repeat something that fitted into some sort of existing, assumed, known way of doing something. And so that's true with, it's a perversity. There's a perversity about wanting to break the rules, I guess, and do what you shouldn't do. Actually, to do something you shouldn't do. I wouldn't stress that too much, really.
Well, I feel like that underlines your relationship to technology in general, because you've tried, as I mentioned in the introduction, so many different moving image technologies, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your evolving relationship to different technologies over your career.
Right. And I think Pat O'Neill is also a person you should ask that kind of question of, because it isn't about the technology. And so I had to think quite a lot about, I think technology and language are continuous with each other, right? That to just change something because of the technology doesn't make any sense to me, unless the things which you can do with the technology actually take you into a new territory of the language, so that you can say things, different things, or say things in a different way. I mean, perhaps an example, I've become increasingly interested in, as you can see, superimpositions. And part of that is that with an anti-narrative, against narrative, I've always seen the kind of consequential structure of narrative as not just false, but didn't ever fit to my experience of what my life was like. My life wasn't a convenient narrative, and it didn't go in that singular, linear way from one thing to another. But I am interested in the issue, in all the things to do with some kind of, can I say, emotional meanings, some kind of charged meaning. And so I've been looking for a long time for ways in which you can actually have a kind of parallelness of narrative. Right, and so even the Cyclops is a very good example of this. That it's like the narrative which is going on constantly, simultaneously, but in 4 dimensions, not in 1 dimension of going from A to B. And they're going on. Whilst one thing is going on the surface, there's something else going on underneath it. And so I've got very interested in technology, in the way in which technology opens up, again, I have to be careful, a different sort of paradigm. I'm trying not to use that kind of language anymore, but a different kind of way in which we understand and structure our experiences. And that's really the important bit for me, that the work is about how we structure our experience, and for the spectator, the audience looking at it, how their choices in watching the work structures their experience of it.
No, I think even a Cyclops is a really remarkable work, and it's amazing that we're conscious of there being screens within a screen, and yet we're not really choosing, okay, I'll watch that one, I'll watch this one. They really compete with each other, and you're playing with asymmetry quite a bit, like to sort of slightly direct. You're not directing our vision, but you're directing our vision to not direct itself somehow, if that makes sense.
Well, I mean, we're getting into quite interesting and important theoretical ideas about that. Because right from the beginning, I started to, for one of the ways in which I was breaking this singularity of the experience was multi-screen, right? So, Little Dog for Roger and Berlin Horse, almost all of my earliest work was shown on more than one screen, 2, sometimes 3, sometimes 4. And it is, in a way, I think, about that you have to make choices. Not conscious choices, you have, but there's not something where you can. I mean, that's for me a really huge problem of conventional narrative, Hollywood narrative, is that the choices are all made for you. And the choices, you can go along with those choices and have an emotional engagement with them, but they're not your choices. And I'm interested for the spectator having their own choice, but it also means that I don't know the answer to the relationship of the images in my own film. I don't know because there isn't a single answer. I try to make sure that it's coordinatable, that it isn't just kind of throwing anything in and it's random. It's got a kind of selected charge to the choices, but I don't know when I'm doing it. I use this term latent meaning, that I'm interested in images which already have a latent meaning. That means that what they actually are creating in your mind is not already predetermined, although it is charged and it's got a frame of, it's got some kind of, I won't use the term logic, but something like a logic. There's a reason. There's a motivated reason why you choose that image, but you don't know why you chose it. You only know that there's something in that. And I'm always looking for this thing which is a latency of interpretation, but within a kind of field where it is worth making an interpretation. I can't control that, but it means that I rely very heavily on an instinct of being fascinated by an image, rather than having an idea and then trying to fit the images to the idea.
We're definitely going to see if people have questions in the audience, but I was hoping for my final question, if you could talk about how that then plays into creating a work like even a Cyclops Pays the Ferryman. Were you working completely intuitively, or how consciously were you structuring that piece?
That was a slightly different work to some of the others that I've done, in that when I was getting in, first of all the images, all the material that I shoot, I don't shoot it for a film. Right? There was a period, I call it my Chronos project, of nearly 10 years or more of shooting material with video camera, with my phone, all sorts of things, just shooting material. And then going through that material and looking at it afresh. None of the material that I shot was shot for a particular film. No. So it's like this huge bank of, almost like the kind of traces of memory. That's a parallel, right? They're there. It's like the more concrete traces of memory, which was my bank of images, and I would respond to them. Now, it became fairly clear to me early on that even the Cyclops was about my father, right? It wasn't like it was at the end I understood that. It became obvious, and it sort of started to change aspects of the construction. And it was also in a kind of allegorical way about the passage from being alive to not being alive to being dead, and the sort of way in which the store of one's experiences and memories might at that point start to kind of form a senility, if you like, a kind of form a big dream. I don't really believe any of that. I mean, I don't think that is what goes on, because it's more an allegory for it than a kind of illustration of what I think is going on. It's not mystical in that sense. And also, it was concentrating on, I was determined that it wouldn't be in any way a religious approach, that it was to do the way in which the material of your body becomes part of other parts of the natural world. I mean, it decays and so on. So I was aware in making Cyclops that the images which I was selecting were related to that, and some of them were actually images of my father, which I'd shot for a completely different reason, I'd shot them mainly when he was very much involved in drinking wine, and some of the images are of him. He had his own. In a greenhouse, he had his own grapes, and I used to make wine from them for him and my mother. Dreadful wine, absolutely awful. I couldn't drink it, but they seemed to like it. And I'd shot it. There was an earlier film called Verite, in Vino Veritas. Veritas. It was called Veritas, and. Some of the shots that are in here were actually shots that I took out from much earlier work, long before he died. There you go. I mean, I truly never know why I'm doing some of these things. I don't.
Does anyone have a question?
I'd like to know.
If we want to do the microphone, either be really loud or we'll try to reach the mic.
Well, if there was one film I wanted to ask a question about, it's The Wharf, which I know was a late addition, and I'm fascinated by it because of its performance aspect.
Which one?
The Wharf.
The Wharf?
Wharf, yeah.
Yes.
Because you make it clear that this is not the definitive, the original performance. So it's the trace of a trace.
Yeah.
I'm very moved by the image of these two people who that was taken decades before the film was made, and I am very intrigued on how it was performed. And there is an image at the end which I cannot make sense of.
Okay.
So if you could talk about actually the dimension of time,
Right.
and how you assimilate it in this piece. Thank you.
Wharf, that piece originally was projected with two slide projectors, fading from one slide projector to another, and I had a set of slides. And at the same time, I had 2 tape recorders with different tapes that I'd produced. And so I was mixing the sound and mixing the images of that I'd take. The images came from long before I started making films, actually. They were probably from 1961 or 1960, when I was a student in Plymouth. And it is on the quay in Plymouth. And I looked at and what fascinated me with the images was this 2 complete strangers who I had no idea who they were, and this sort of fascination of, the narrative you make for yourself about them. Are they lovers? And then now what interests me is, where are they? Are they still alive? And because you don't specify who they are or what, you can start thinking about that thing of what happens to people in time, and that extraordinary thing of taking a photographic image. A photographic image is a kind of tyranny. It's the same in Little Dog for Roger. The pictures of my mother is a sort of tyranny that it makes you aware that person who was a beautiful young woman now doesn't exist, and yet people are taking, including me, take photographs as if you can somehow preserve something forever. And you can't. I think one of the reasons I like the fact that some of the things are soft focus, out of focus, and coming in and out is it makes sure in a way that you don't identify too strongly with the person as a particular person. So it allows it to become allegorical. But again, when I was performing it, I also sometimes, there's a film called Tala, which was a lot of the same material, in lots of the same location shot in Tala. And when I did the performance with this, I would often also run Tala over the top of it. So there was never it was pretty much improvised, but it was improvised within the sequence of the still photographs that are here is the sequence that I used to project them in when I first did it. But it's not an authentic thing, and I think with performance and film, I don't think anything is authentic. Like the last film we just saw, if I want to change the soundtrack, I change the soundtrack, and even when I do the show at Filmforum, I'm showing a version of Finity, which was originally shown on a screen about twice the size of that in the Tate Modern, and it's a 6 projector piece, and runs for about 45 minutes. And I wanted to do a version of it that I could show more easily, and I made a single screen version of it, quite modified, that I showed at Tate Britain because they wanted to do it. And I was not happy with I thought that with all these images brought together, I didn't think it functioned for the 45 minutes. So I've got a new version of that, and I shall see it for the first time at Filmforum. And when I see it, I'm quite sure I shall say to myself, look, I wouldn't mind changing this. And that's one of the things about the digital production system, is that you can continually make new versions of things. You're not tied like you are with the cost of of 16mm film or the 35mm film production, the cost of that pretty much ties you to a single version of something. I am quite happy to be making things which are slightly different from what they were when I first showed them. It doesn't bother me because it's part of the technology that there is now no such thing as a definitive version. And that's like with, Warhol's multiples, and we're past the period, and it's very intrinsic to film, because it's a copying medium. It's not like painting or sculpture, it's a copying medium. And it has built within it the assumption that, first of all, it's multiple copies, and then with the digital program can make small changes. The Atari ones that I did, the program that I made for 3 of the Atari works, if I put in different values at the beginning, it would produce a slightly different version. And there were slightly different versions because the program itself, if I put a different set of start values in, it produced it, and my only concern was, I want all of them to be worth looking at, right? Not just because they're random and different. I don't think people have to ask questions, they can make comments.
That's true too. I was going to say, when we were emailing about Finity, you cut it down, and then you said, okay, I think I see about 5 more minutes that I could get rid of here. Like with Finity, you were really working on that and changing it. And, so and after this show, it might be different again. Comments, questions? Yeah.
I was just thinking a lot about the textile quality of
The textile quality.
Yeah,
Yes.
Joseph's new coat.
Yes.
And the last one as well, the aberration, how
Yeah.
the video turns into fabric and texture,
Yeah.
like a tactile quality of actually creating
Yeah.
fabric, especially Joseph's new coat. It became like a woven piece of video. I found it very interesting, and we used the elements over like earth, wind, and fire, and air seems to be a running theme as well as this element. And like even the Cyclops, like that you're layering it, and it becomes the sort of beginning of the Cyclops, where the effects become this like embroidered piece.
No, I think you're right, and I mean, I certainly notice it with Joseph's new coat. I thought it, frequently looks to me like textile design. I'm thinking of it now as a sort of flag for the world. Rather than a flag for Britain, it's a moving flag for the world. But the other thing it has little bits of is like the transparent sweet wrappers, and I see all those things in. When I sit and watch it, I'm like you. I'm looking at it and seeing things which I hadn't seen before. But I agree with you about the textile kind of quality. I'm not so sure about it in the Cyclops, but it is there as well, and it is a texture. There are sections that are a texture. But yes, I don't disagree with that.
So you have new earlier pieces.
I don't think this will get up there.
I don't know if this will reach. Can you yell?
Can I hear? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, can you yell?
Even if you're yelling, I'm not sure I can hear you. I'm going to go up.
There we go. Come down.
Oh, right, that's a good solution.
So in your pieces, you had some pieces that were like 1967 or 1970, and then you put electronic music. So it wasn't just your last one, but you put electronic music from like 2012. did I see my?
Which ones had elected?
It was
There's Brian Eno's track on
the one before Brian Eno.
But no, it wasn't electronic. It was, I made...
Was it the one with the colors and the grids? And
Your Lips,
Yeah.
the soundtrack on that.
That's the one after. Let me get
With the 6.
Right, that is electronic.
Yeah. But the music came like 2000 something, and your piece was done.
Yes. Well, I'd made that was another one where I had previously made a soundtrack. It's more complicated than
So
that.
what was the soundtrack before?
Very similar. It was very similar before that because it was made in collaboration with a rock musician called Stuart Louis de Cannonville, and he was working with a group of people, but I was working with him. He gave me the original, he composed the original material. The group that he was working with about 2 or 3 years ago got in touch with me and said that they were partially responsible for the soundtrack, and they didn't have a contract with me, and they wanted royalties for using it. So I said, what's the word that begins with F? You, or a word to that effect. My grandson makes very good sound for, and he wants to do it. So I said, I'll strip your soundtrack off and put a new one on. Right?
That's very interesting to see these pieces over.
The truth is, I'm happier with his soundtrack than the other one. I think there's something more surprising for me. The other one fitted a bit more to my aesthetic, and working with my grandson, I'm forced into another kind of slightly different aesthetic, which I like actually. Okay.
What could you address the way in which Cyclops was remixed? I noticed that at the end.
Oh, Malcolm, can you explain what is meant by that Cyclops was remixed?
Yes.
Is the title.
Right. Not very much remix actually. I just there were certain things in there which I saw and that I wanted to change, and it was pretty much with all my original source material, but there were some very small shifts, but because I'd done it, I did want to record the fact that I'd done it, and that's very not hardly any different. If I showed you the previous version before the remix, you probably wouldn't see a lot of difference or hear a lot of difference. But I just wanted to do the remix.
That makes sense. Those are.
And I had better equipment.
I know
I had
those too.
for listening to it.
Do you think that the old technology was more fun to play than new, or the opposite?
Can you say what?
I didn't quite hear it myself.
Do you
We have two deaf people up here, basically.
Do you think that old technology was more fun to play with than today's technology?
Oh, is the old technology
Yes.
more fun to play with than the new technology? Or?
Oh, no, I hated film. No, that's, I mean, I was not at all sorry not to be spending hours in the darkroom with film technology. It was expensive, noisy. It was a long distance between the making of it and seeing how it looked. And sometimes when if you went through commercial labs, which I didn't do, or even when I developed it myself, the amount of stuff which actually didn't work as well in the printing. And so I think, for me, film became a kind of clumsy. There's a system for editing on a Steenbeck and with multiple soundtracks on. It's so much easier to work with when you're working with it digitally, and which opens up actually, for me, the possibility of doing what I think was more sophisticated things than I could do working with film. And it was more pleasurable to be. I could work in the daylight, you know, and but lots of those things. I got very tired of working with film, and I was, you know, I think I think it's 1982. I think on my birthday, the 15th of May, I went out for the first time with a new Video 8 camera, a big one. Video 8, not high 8, a Video 8 camera. And I shot a lot of stuff out in the country and came back and put it through on the television. I thought, I like that. You know, there's something about it. And it was good, enough definition. Also, if you shot it carefully, because I did three things for Channel 4, the national television company in England. And it was at the time when the technicians in television were actually rejecting stuff that was what they thought substandard. But I found that I was shooting stuff on Video 8 and incorporating it, they didn't even notice. So by this time, you know, the quality factor had jumped. It wasn't. I did some things with old video. I mean, I did a video. I don't show them, but I did stuff with the black and white Sony machine, some feedback things. But I didn't take to that, and I didn't take to that the kind of feel of the monitor with. And then I thought was less interesting than film. But now I find I can do much more things more easily and that suit me better with digital systems than with film. I wouldn't touch film unless somebody paid me an awful lot of money. It must be getting to drinking time, shouldn't it?
I actually came here tonight not knowing what I was going to, and I randomly have seen that at the Tate Modern.
Yes.
I saw that film.
Oh, you saw Finity?
And I didn't, after just watching your films now, I put the two together going, oh God, I have to know your work. It's brilliant. I came blindly tonight.
Yeah.
But with my question with you is just so much of your work is almost painterly, like they blur into almost charcoal drawings, the black and whites, and the abstract kind of colour blocking reminds me of Albers and all these things. I know you went to Slade, and I wonder, is there an element of art and painting and drawing that you see when you do the work?
I mean, I'd be foolish to deny that. I mean, in a way, it is obvious.
Yeah.
I said, do you want me to use the mic?
I can't won't reach over there.
Yeah. As I said, my main influences were painting and particularly jazz music, Ornette Coleman and Dizzy Gillespie and people like that, and I played jazz in kind of New Orleans band, and then in a sort of Ellington kind of band, and so it was really an important thing for me. Film, it's a long story for me. First of all, at the time I started to make my films, I'd already developed an extremely strong standpoint against narrative cinema, right? It wasn't that I didn't know narrative cinema. Like, I grew up before television, and like almost all the population, and certainly all my younger generation, we went to the cinema all the time, and we saw all the standard films, and particularly the westerns and so on. We saw all that as a child. Then when I went to London to the Slade, I also saw all of the work that was considered advanced cinema, like Godard, Truffaut, René, all that stuff, and I saw masses of it. I even voluntarily studied Godard's Alphaville, which had a, you know, I found it very interesting film. I went into the cinema with a tape recorder and recorded the sound right through, and then bought the script in a book and studied that. Not as a student, I just was interested in it. But I was absolutely certain when I started making film that I was not only didn't want to make films in that way, I was against films being made in that way. I was looking for something much more complicated. I happened to be starting to. I moved from not in one go, but I was still continued painting. But I moved from painting to film, but with actually, in a primitive way, I had no knowledge of the American underground at that time. Not even I knew Warhol's, some hints about Warhol, but I wasn't aware of the American underground. I wasn't aware of other experimental filmmakers in Europe, like Wilhelm Hein and Birgit Hein and Kurt Krenn. And I was also completely ignorant of the early experiments made by people like Duchamp and Léger and so on, and Man Ray in using film, because it was missing from the culture. It was not, you know, I had to go digging around and researching it. When I wrote the book, Abstract Film, I was actually finding out stuff that I had no idea existed. So, in a way, the first film, first 16mm film I made, Castle One, was a sort of punk film that was destroying cinema, really destroying cinema, but also destroying my own sensibilities about cinema, and opening up then the possibility of doing something that was in a different kind of aesthetic approach. And it was obvious that I was building on that visual sensibility. You know, the people I liked were people like Matisse and the Berlin Horse. For me, I always said it was a Fauvist film, right? I also had a theory at the time that there had not been a modernist period in film history. There was nothing in film history at all that corresponded to the modernist break that happened in painting, sculpture, music, in all the other arts, but it didn't happen in film. I couldn't think of a single film. We get hints of it with things like Chris Marker and so on, but it's only hints of it. And even with Godard, for me, Godard was not really a modernist filmmaker. He was an old-fashioned filmmaker doing some quite new, interesting things. So it's obvious that the main influence for me is from the image, not necessarily from painting, but from the quality of the things that go on when you're interpreting something through your eye and your ear. So that's, I think, as close an answer as I can give you. I think it must be about that time we went out of beer, isn't it? Those people as well, they can serve.
Yeah, we're going to have a beer now. So thank you all very much.